right, greetings everybody. Thanks for being here. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and thanks for joining us today again about this discussion. We have a couple of people joining us today. I want to go over a couple of functionality things with the webinar, just as a reminder and a refresher. For our speakers, if you have questions, please enter those in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screens, and I'll field those questions to the speakers. Sometimes I'll interrupt them if the question that's asked is particularly relevant for that very second, but for the most part, I'll kind of hold off till the end and sort of pitch them for our Q&A session at the end. So ask questions whenever you want, but just because I don't immediately stop the presses and ask it, don't think that it's not going to be asked. We may get to it at the end. First, I want to introduce Eric Owens. Eric is the head honcho at ADI for all of us, and he's going to join us today, talk a little bit about ADI in general, the ADI industry state of the union in general, and of course our conference is coming up in August. So take it away, Mr. Owens.
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to have you here with us. First off, I wanted to mention the ADI conference in San Antonio. It will be August 25th and 26th. Both Stephen Gould and Chris Swanger will be there. The keynote speaker is Alexander Gabriel. It will be in San Antonio. Like I said, we'll have the Whiskey Summit there. And yeah, registration is currently open. It's going very good. I started working for ADI in 2016, and the industry was a much different place at that time. The amount of distilleries was growing exponentially, and there were, however, the barriers to entry and the threats to the businesses at that time. We still are fighting a lot of those fights, trying to get direct to consumer shipping, trying to get selling at farmers markets. All of those things are still in play, but the tariffs were definitely not what they are today. So it's really great to have Stephen and Chris on here to talk about the sort of current threats to the industry. And yeah, that's all I got. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing the presentation.
Thanks, Eric. As another reminder, real quickly, for everybody who's here, on the resources tab that you see down at the bottom, you'll find two links. One will take you directly to the registration for our annual conference in San Antonio in August, where you can sign up right there. And then the second link is to join ADI. I mean, I'd be remiss if I did not remind everybody how important it is that to us that you be part of this community. And so if you're not a current member and would consider joining, we would appreciate you doing that. I promise you, especially when you look at the expense of your own time and what a consultant costs. I promise you're going to get $350 worth of free advice out of this webinar alone. And so we really would like you to join and be part of us and be part of the community. With that, I'm simply going to introduce Chris Swanger, the president and CEO of Discus, and Stephen Gould, the president and consulting distiller of Consulting Alchemist, and they're gonna slowly get us towards this subject matter. But Chris, why don't you start and sort of talk a little bit about Discus and the latest and greatest over there?
Great, thank you, John. And let me just follow up and encourage everyone, if you can, be sure to be in San Antonio at the end of August for the ADI conference. I have the privilege of going every year and so forth. So I know a big subject item today is to talk about the tariffs. Steve's going to give some good counsel and advice on how to navigate international markets, where the opportunities are. And as y'all can imagine, I'm sure everybody on the webinar is familiar with Discus. Discus has been working on trade barriers, and we've been in the thick of things from the tariff perspective, working with our counterpart trade associations around the world, particularly in the big markets where we've been hit, like in Canada, Mexico, the EU, and the UK, but also working on trade barriers in countries and markets like India, Vietnam, and so forth. So hopefully I can give you an update because I am and Discus we are in direct consultations with all of our major trading partners. Of course, we're in direct consultations with the Trump administration as well. And I do believe, knock on wood, if everything plays right, and despite the turbulence and the chaos the entire country is going through as it relates to the tariffs, the uncertainty with it all, if time will tell, if we get through this and the Trump administration gets its way, I think there is an opportunity, particularly in our key trading markets, to untangle distilled spirits from this tariff fiasco that we've been involved with over the past 5 or 6 years. And I can answer a lot of questions and give you perspectives on why I think that here in a bit. But let me just say this, which is a core message that I've had the privilege to register in tons of media. The media covers the tariff stuff quite a bit. And the Discus communications machine has been in full operation. So the one message that I have conveyed, both in the media and with the Trump administration, is the great American success story. And what that means is I drive the message that 20 plus years ago, there were only about 60 distilleries in the United States. And today there's over 3,100. And that is an awesome American success story. And we've got beautiful distilleries sprinkled all around the country. And in terms of our big trading markets, which are the UK, Mexico, Canada, Japan, and the EU, we have lived in a world historically with zero for zero tariffs. And my message to the Trump administration, whether it's been the Secretary of Commerce or the USTR rep or folks at the White House, is one reason why there's been an element of great growth in the craft distillery movement. Of course, you've got great Americans like Bill Owens and David Pickerel, God bless them, that have helped many of y'all come to market, but also the ability to export your products in markets where there's been zero for zero tariffs. And 86% of our exports go to markets where there's zero for zero tariffs. 86% of our exports go to markets with zero for zero tariffs. So as I'm engaging directly with the Trump administration, we're trying to convey that story. And, as we're all grappling with the somewhat depressed market challenges, one of the best ways for many of our distilleries to be able to drive revenue, and Steve can give you firsthand experience on that, is to be able to send your great products, whether it's Australia, Mexico, Canada, or the EU or the UK, zero for zero tariffs are the way to go. And the other thing that I have conveyed to the Trump administration is we are the model for fair and reciprocal trade. And because when we have zero for zero tariffs, American whiskey, American distilled spirits, whether it's gin, rum, vodka, you name it, can compete. So the other thing I want to just to leave with you, and Discus has been in the thick of this for years, I think about 18 years. We partner with the U.S. Department of Agriculture on a market access program. So we'll get about 1 million plus a year, maybe 1.5 million, give or take, in money to help promote American distilled spirits products in markets around the world. So we can take distillers to big trade shows in Berlin, in the UK. I think, Steve, you went on one maybe in Japan or Singapore. a couple
I've
of years
actually done
ago.
about a dozen of them,
That
and
doesn't.
this program was instrumental in our penetrating the UK, EU markets, the Taiwan market, and actually Taiwan was direct USDA map, but you guys were there. We did go to Japan, but we're never able to ship to Japan. We did go with you to Mexico, and that actually helped us in
There for
Mexico.
that. That was my first one. Yeah.
So yeah, the program is incredibly valuable. And I can't say enough about Discus's leadership in the MAP program and how it can help, especially smaller players, enter foreign markets. Right now, we're going to talk about the chaos that's going on, which is, of course, in the short term impeding that. But the MAP program is hugely valuable if
And
that's where you
Steve,
want to
help me
go.
with this because, I'm at the 30,000 foot level, in my role at Discus. But when you go on those MAP programs, Discus plays a role to facilitate introductions with buyers in those international markets and so
To an
forth.
extent, but really the buyers, tours, etc. But the biggest thing is that they give you a venue where you can get in front of buyers and sell yourself.
Yeah.
And so, for example, you used to do VinExpo Bordeaux, you're doing BCB London coming
Yeah.
up, you're doing BCB Germany. All three of those shows resulted in my old distillery, Golden Moon, making trading contacts that allowed us to enter those marketplaces. And at one point, and so everyone knows Golden Moon is closed at this point for a variety of reasons. But in 2018, largely because of Discus and the MAP program, 25% of my revenues were in Mexico, and 40% of my revenues were split between the UK and the EU. So it was a huge piece of my company's revenue that we would not have had it not been for Discus and the USDA market access program giving us entrees into those foreign markets.
And Steve, if I may, I'm going to give one example, then turn it over to you, and then I'll fall back and be ready to answer specific questions about what's going on, what is Discus doing with Canada, Mexico, the UK, and the EU. But let me give you a little example of where the MAP program can fit in, and it's complementary to our advocacy in terms of knocking down trade barriers. All of y'all may know the largest whiskey market in the world is India. India. And historically, India's had 150% tariff on all distilled spirits. It's Scotch, it can be American whiskey, and so forth. So with the president and his very aggressive, unorthodox trade posture for fair and reciprocal trade, 2.5 months ago, when Prime Minister Modi's flying in to meet with the president in the Oval Office, Modi proactively reduced the tariff on American whiskey from 150% to 100%. Now it's still 100% tariff. American whiskey's got a tick of market share in India. But as the US and India are negotiating a real free trade agreement in earnest, we're working directly with the Trump administration to bring that now 100% tariff down to zero. Then we've got a long-term game to play in India. I mean, that's not going to help us in the immediate, but that is a positive example of what the craziness of the president's policy can give us in return if we can get through the turbulence, right? And in addition to that, the Discus Market Access Program team is working on a trip to India, I think at the end of October, where distillers who may be interested in going over there, there'll be an opportunity. And some of the cost of it is paid through the MAP programs, right? I typically go on the MAP programs when there's an advocacy component to it. So obviously, as the US is negotiating a free trade agreement in India, I'll likely go on the MAP program to India because we'll have two components of it. advocacy. I'm sure I'd be meeting with Indian government officials and US government officials there, but also we'll have a good group of distillers that are going over there, maybe laying the groundwork. So that's an example how the MAP program and the advocacy program come hand in hand. So Steve, back over to you.
All right, everybody. So I'm going to pull up the presentation. Let me introduce myself real quick. Some of you may know who I am. More likely than not, most of you don't. I've been around the distilling and alcohol beverage industry off and on for about 35 years. I've had several other careers. Many people in the industry know me as a master distiller, as a award-winning American single malt producer, an award-winning gin producer, absinthe producer, etc. What most people in the alcohol beverage industry don't know me as, which I am, is I've been doing international trade literally since my teens. I founded over a dozen companies, half of which were heavy international operating companies. I worked as an executive at Ford Motor Company for a decade, where I spent several years doing nothing but customs and trade compliance and optimization. I am a licensed U.S. customs broker. I ran Ford's supply chain in Asia, as well as working heavily across the Canadian and Mexican borders on behalf of Ford. I ran Tyco Plastic and Adhesives global supply chain. I've taught this stuff at a top 20 MBA program, Case Western Reserve University at the time. And I've worked for one of the top consulting firms in the world doing international supply chain, customs and trade advisory work for half a dozen of the Fortune 50. And then, as I said, I've owned a variety of different companies. As an example, when I was running Ford's supply chain in Asia, I had a side business, which Ford was aware of, where I was exporting brewery overstocks and other materials out of the US, predominantly into China. So this is craft beer that was near its expiration date, back when the Chinese first started bringing stuff in. And then when I was working in India for Ford, I cut a deal with Allied Domecq where I was buying their excess capacity of Scottish blended whiskey bottled in India and exporting that out of India into China by the container load. So I've done a bunch of movement of materials in different roles. The other thing I've done a lot of is sourcing and sourcing optimization, and that includes sourcing U.S. whiskeys for several of the big producers in India. That includes sourcing Canadian neutral spirit for one of the largest alcohol companies in the world for export out of Canada, initially into the US and then elsewhere. And that includes going in for international investment groups and major producers and valuing distilleries and distillery inventories based on what's going on in the current market. And my clients include people like Swiss banks and major distilling corporations and et cetera. So I've got this broad spectrum of international operations experience that makes me somewhat unique in the distilled spirits industry, which is why I get to talk at you today, and hopefully what I have to say you'll find valuable. Now, as I pull this up, let's see if I can get this thing to work. Why isn't there? It is. As I pull this up, I want to talk about what we're going to talk about today. And one of the things I want to emphasize, there we go. Can everyone see that now?
I can see it, yeah.
One of the things I want to emphasize is we're not going to talk about politics today. We're going to talk about the basic underpinnings of international trade. And the intent is to give you, the attendee, a basic fundamental understanding, and some of you may already have some of that. And if you have more advanced questions, please ask them, of how international trade and tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers work, with the intent of better helping you as business people in the alcohol beverage ecosystem to know the right types of questions to ask to help you navigate the current chaos, which can be described as a hostile trade environment. We will have some answers today, but there's so many things are changing so fast that we may not have all the answers you want, but we can give you the information to be able to go out to your customs brokers, your trade advisory consultants, your professionals in your own companies, and other organizations, and ask the right questions to try and figure out what options you have as a business person moving forward to better navigate these things. So having said that, so today we're going to talk about the current international trade environment, and we've already talked about that a little bit, but we'll talk about that a little more. Understanding what an import and export actually is. And surprisingly, most people may or may not understand what those terms really mean compared to what we think of what they mean. What customs territory is as opposed to sovereign territory, which is an important concept if you're doing a fair amount of international trade. And it's become even more important in today's environment because of both what I'm going to call tariff engineering and cash flow optimization. Tariffs and duties explained. We'll go through the basic underpinnings of what a tariff and a duty is. The harmonized tariff code system. And this goes back to what I just mentioned is tariff optimization or tariff engineering, because these are the codes that are used predominantly worldwide. I think it's 173 countries now that recognize some sort of harmonized tariff code. Theoretically, they're all synchronized, but they're not really. And then Incoterms. And Incoterms are hugely important because these are the contractual terms that are recognized internationally that set where a buyer and a seller's responsibilities transfer. So responsibility for cost, responsibility for liability. And then we're going to talk tied to the Incoterms a little bit about how you may want to structure your invoices again to minimize your tariff exposure and to understand who's paying what costs where. So the first thing I wanted to show you is this kind of cool little picture. Now, this is a 2,600, I think, if I'm not mistaken, year-old shipwreck. And what you see at several thousand feet below sea level are a bunch of amphora. Now, amphora are ceramic vessels that were used in the ancient world to carry commodities. And the common commodities typically were grain, olive oil, and wine. And the vast majority of the amphora that you find on shipwrecks from 2, 3, 4,000 years ago are one of those three commodities. The reason this is germane is that alcohol beverages have been traded internationally literally since the dawn of human civilization. And we know this because we have archaeological evidence of it, one of which is the shipwreck you're looking at. So international trade and people moving alcohol beverages from community to community, from country to country, from nation state to nation state is nothing new. And there have been tariff and non-tariff trade barriers, if you will, or trade challenges that literally go back as far as human civilization, as far as the earliest of economic systems that we as the human civilization has. So the current trade environment. So in the last, give or take 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, since the end of World War II, the international economy has moved towards more open trading borders and lower tariff and non-tariff trade barriers. What we as Americans today have experienced through all of our lives is an environment where goods relatively easily have crossed borders, allowing for the growth of international commerce in both goods and services. What we're now seeing in both the last Trump administration and the current Trump administration is a change in the view of the way that tariffs are used as to regulate international trade. And what I mean by that is we have in the current administration a belief that these are elements of leverage that can be used to cut deals, which is something we've never seen a president and an administration do in the modern world. And so that's something that in the long term may or may not be beneficial for the US, but in the short term, because it's kind of turning the entire international economy on its head, is causing chaos. And so we as
Let
business
me
people,
let me interject on this just so, and again, this is not, yeah, Discus is Switzerland, right? We've got to
Mhm.
work on both sides of the aisle, just so everybody has some context. From a Trump administration's perspective, this more open trading environment has created, from their perspective, massive trade deficits, which we can talk about. The
Mhm.
spirits industry in the US has a massive trade deficit
Mhm.
between the EU, the UK, Mexico, and Canada. But it's
Mhm.
not because of trade barriers, it's because American consumers love scotch or Irish whiskey or tequila and cognac and so forth. But when Russia and China have over 70% of the steel and aluminum market,
Mhm.
the Trump administration has determined that is a major national security issue. If we get in a global conflict, we might not be wanting to source steel and aluminum from those two countries, right?
Mhm.
And then, Trump, and it remains to be seen if it's going to work. But as we've been operating in a more global trading environment, more manufacturing has moved offshore because it's cheaper and so forth. And the aspiration of the Trump administration is trying to bring more American manufacturing back here to the shores of the United States. It remains to be seen if that is going to be able to happen or not. And we'll see. We're in the thick of it. But what's unique about the distilled spirits industry is we're not widgets, and you all know that. We are an industry of distinctive products where you can only make American whiskey here in the United States. Same for tequila. You all know that. Some folks in the Trump administration didn't understand that because they're looking at it from trade deficits
Mhm.
and American manufacturing. We cannot relocate a beautiful tequila distillery to the United States, right? So part of our education is to help the new administration and colleagues that may not be as familiar with our industry understand that. Unfortunately, we've been caught up in the whirlwind of what the Trump administration is trying to do. Does that make sense, Steve?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And that goes to right where I was going next, and that is this chaos, regardless of where politically we all sit,
Yeah.
this chaos leads us as members of the alcohol beverage ecosystem to need to be able to weather the storm and make as effective business decisions as we can make. Now, what that means, given the uncertainty, is that we as business people need options. And right now, what we're seeing across the industry and across most industries in the US, and for that matter, offshore, is the vast majority of the business community is a lot of people say, well, we're in a wait and see mode. I'm going to actually liken this to we're a deer in the headlights mode. And that people don't know what to do, don't know what's coming, so they're frozen. And the reality is that as business people, the more we can understand the underpinnings of the storm we're in and come up with effective options based that we can use as the situation changes, the better off our businesses and the overall alcohol and beverage ecosystem is going to be in the long run. And so the entire intent here is to understand a bit of what's going on and then move from there forward to be able to make better decisions as things change.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about imports and exports. Let's go up. So what's an import? So an import is when, and this may sound very rudimentary, but we're going to talk about it anyway. An import is when a business in a country decides for whatever reason that they want to buy raw materials, components, or finished goods from another country. So the term import literally means an inbound shipment and a inbound commercial transaction. An export is the other side of the same coin. And that is when a nation with businesses within those nations decides to sell their raw materials, their commodities, their finished goods, their services across a sovereign border to another nation. It's pretty simple, except that it's not. So when you have import and export transactions, it's a single set of flows. And I like to break it down into three flows: material flow, fiscal flow, and information flow. Now, most people focus on a very high level macro material flow and fiscal flow and tend not to really worry too much about information flow. What's really important is that businesses do a deep dive and map all three of these flows. So, for example, if you're buying, and if you look at this map, I'm going to look at the Chinese supplier in this case. You've got your red, which is your material flow. Assume that's glass bottles, which a sizable portion of our industry does import from China. And we're going to talk further about dumping and all of that down the road, which is another topic, but that's related. So a lot of times in the past, it's been very easy for a beverage manufacturer in the US to simply send an email to a Chinese glass bottle supplier, say, ship this, it shows up in the US, they send a wire payment, and the deal's done. As we move into a more hostile environment where everything is under the microscope, where tariffs are changing, where multiple tariffs are being levied at the same time, now we need to take a look in more detail at every single stop that material moves, where it's being stored, and all the associated costs and regulatory points along that material flow. Tied to that, we need to look at the information flow so that we can track the movement of those goods from order to delivery, including the information that the various regulatory authorities see as it moves through that physical flow. And at the same time, we need to understand in stark detail exactly how and where the money's going and what it's paying for. Now, I'll give you a great example. If you move a container load of glass out of China, right now, the average importer is going to get a single dollar value, say, and I'm making up numbers here, $1,000 for a container load of glass. Now, that's probably way low, but let's go with it. When that hits the US border, that may or may not include all shipping, all storage, all demurrage, all handling, all clearance, depending upon the terms of sale. Most companies today, most especially smaller companies, don't have full visibility to what those are. The problem being under a hyper tariff environment is that if that invoice comes in with $1,000 valuation that includes all these other costs, and it may or may not, you're paying duty on $1,000. That glass may be only $700 of that $1,000. The other stuff may be storage and brokerage fees and service fees and freight costs that may or may not be subject to duty. But if they're not broken out, if you don't understand them, when they hit the border, you're going to be paying a tariff on something you shouldn't be paying a tariff on. Does that make sense? Similarly, there may be fees associated with your financial transactions, when and how you pay those transactions. There may be fees with moving money and whatever type of financial instrument you're using, whether it's a wire transfer, which fees are minimal, or whether you're doing a letter of credit, which is a little old school, but you still see it quite a bit in the China trade, especially for larger and capital equipment moves, or a variety of other types of bank facilitated movements of money. There's going to be costs associated with that. as a business, especially in this hyper environment with costs rising, you need to break down and understand what all those costs are and make sure you're only paying what you should be paying for. And then there's information flow, and information flow is your visibility. Very often in the modern world, it's a few emails, but the reality is you probably want to be able to see soup to nuts where your goods are, what you're paying for, how things are moving, and understand the regulatory information that's required at each stop by each regulatory agency that touches that shipment. Because if not, you may have some unpleasant surprises in store for you. Surprises that even savvy international businesses aren't used to seeing, which may in the hostile environment we're in now suddenly come alive. All right, are there any questions on that before we move on? All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the concept of sovereign territory versus customs territory. So the concept of sovereignty is only a few hundred years old. And what it means is that there is a sovereign government with very fixed borders. And if you go back even 300-400 years, a lot of your borders were very movable. So during the colonial period, borders were subject to interpretation. They were subject to treaty at times. They were subject to who happened to be there at times. Today in the modern world, we have these political borders which are very starkly defined. And when they're breached, there can be repercussions, whether it's a duty, a tax, a tariff, etc. Now, here in North America, our borders up until the last few years have been relatively open. And our borders between Canada and the US are essentially a little more than border markers. Even with Mexico, there are sections that are a little more than border markers. And economic trade, both legal and illegal, has flown across those borders. And to a large part, that can be argued it's good, but you can also argue that it's bad because of things like fentanyl and et cetera. What we need to understand is that a sovereign border is a political border, but not necessarily a customs border. So customs territory is the territory where a sovereign nation will allow goods to enter its economic territory. So in the United States and in most industrialized countries, there are things called bonded customs warehouses and foreign trade zones. Now, a bonded customs warehouse is not the same as an alcohol bonded warehouse. Though the concept is similar, they are different. A bonded customs warehouse or a foreign trade zone, or I think Canada calls them free trade zones, Mexico calls them free trade zones, are extraterritorial territory for customs purposes. What this means is that while goods have entered the sovereign territory of a country, they have not entered the customs territory, and therefore duties, taxes, excise taxes may or may not need to be paid depending upon the individual regulations. What it further means that in some cases that you can bring goods into the bonded customs warehouse or the foreign trade zone and manipulate those goods without having to pay customs duties, tariffs, alcohol excise tax, and the like. Now, those rules in the US have changed dramatically in the last 90 days, and they're a moving target. So, for example, pre 4 months ago anyway, in the automotive industry, every automotive plant in the United States was a foreign trade zone. You could bring in automotive components and raw materials without paying duty. And while most automotive components had a 2.5% duty, or sorry, a 3.5% duty, a finished vehicle would only have 2.5% duty. So what the car companies used to be able to do, and this has all changed in the last several months, was they could build a car with US and foreign components and then only pay that 2.5% duty on the foreign content of the finished vehicle. Now, at least temporarily, that has changed in the US. But there is still an advantage in that they can bring all that foreign material in to build it into a car in the US and not have a duty liability until it enters the US customs territory. So what that means is that there are advantages, at least for cash flow and possibly for duty and tariff and tax optimization, in the use of extraterritorial territory or outside US customs territory for importers. Right now, the regulations are so fluid that if you are looking at doing something like this, cash flow is probably your major driver, where 6 months ago it might be duty optimization. But certainly no options are off the table, and you should be working with some sort of trade advisory person or customs broker that can help you navigate the ever-changing waters as it relates to these concepts. At a minimum, if you've got large volumes of material coming into the US, or for that matter, going into other countries, you probably should be looking at the use of bonded warehouses or foreign trade zones from a cash flow perspective, because it can defer your need to have to pay duties and taxes at the time of import. Now, having said that, there are some risks and costs that need to be understood. So if you're going to use extraterritorial territory, bonded warehouse free trade zone, you need to understand that there are additional dryage, demurrage, storage, handling fees, and brokerage fees that all need to be accounted for. And then the other thing you need to keep in mind is every time you touch a shipment as it moves through your supply chain, every time you store it, you move it, you handle it, there becomes another opportunity for inventory shrinkage through pilferage, through damage, through loss, where you could actually lose part of your shipment. And that's true anywhere in your supply chain, not just in a bonded warehouse or a free trade zone. But having said that, these are an extra stop through your flow, through that material flow. And you just need to make sure you go in with your eyes open and understand all associated costs and risks. Are there any questions with that? All right, let's move on. So we're going to talk a little bit about a duty or a tariff. Now, duty and tariff, for the purposes of this discussion, are synonymous. I want to make very clear that people understand that when we talk about tariffs in today's discussion, these are international trade tariffs related to a border crossing, not the same as a freight tariff. So in the shipping world, a freight tariff is a term used to describe the amount charged for the movement of goods. That is entirely different from an international duty or tariff. So just to be clear there, a duty or a tariff is a tax. Okay? And when I say it's a tax, for those of us in the alcohol beverage industry, it is structured essentially the same way as an alcohol excise tax, but it is collected by a different government entity than excise tax is collected by. There's different methods of structuring them. We're going to talk about those in a second. But ultimately, a duty or tariff is a tax. It is paid at the time of import. And ultimately, those costs need to be borne by somebody, typically on the receiving end of the shipment, whether it's the importer, the wholesaler, the retailer, or through the three-tier system, or the consumer. Most taxes or most tariffs in the United States are ad valorem basis. So an ad valorem tax is basically a tax based on the value of the goods. That's why when I mentioned before, if you on your invoices, if you have a single price including delivery, you may be paying your duty or tariff on your freight costs as well when you don't need to. A specific tariff is a tax assessed on the quantity, weight, or volume of goods and material. For those of us that deal with distilled spirits, wine, beer, etc. in the United States, our excise tax in the US is typically structured not as an ad valorem, but as a specific tariff. This is your $13 and change, $13.50 on a proof gallon. So it's assessed on the volume of alcohol being brought in as opposed to the value of alcohol being brought in. That is not the case with customs in the US. So when you bring in alcohol, an alcohol product from another country, you're going to be faced with an ad valorem tariff or multiple ad valorem tariffs in the current environment based on the value of that shipment. And then your excise tax will be a specific tariff based on the volume of alcohol. Then you have compound tariffs. Now, the compound tariffs are tariffs that are based both on the ad valorem value and specific value of goods. So in some cases, you're going to see tariffs, and we could see these in the US, where someone's going to say, we're going to give you, a fixed rate per bottle of whatever, plus a tariff on the value. Currently in our industry, I can't think of a single example of a true compound tariff, but it doesn't mean in these negotiations we're in with other countries and in the environment when someone may not decide to try on one of those for size, if that makes sense. And then we have multi-tiered tariffs. Now, multi-tiered tariffs in the alcohol industry are common on the excise tax side of the fence, but they're not common on the other side of the fence. So for the international tariff, you don't typically see multi-tiered tariffs in the US, though you do in other countries. But on the excise tax side of the fence, this is what the Craft Beverage Modernization Act excise taxes are. So you have a lower rate of tax or tariff on the first 100,000 proof gallons that are imported under CBMA, and a higher rate of tax on the balance, which is $13.50 versus $2.82, if I remember my numbers correctly. I think the numbers have changed a little bit. It might be $2.70 and $13.46, but I'd have to look it up. But it's a multi-tiered tariff. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions? Now, the other thing to understand in the current environment is that depending on where you're importing from, unlike at any other time in recent US American history, we now are facing what we call stacked tariffs. What that means is you're going to get a specific tariff from a specific country on a specific good. Then you're going to get a variety of other tariffs that may be tied to the fentanyl fight. As of 10 days ago, I believe it was, we've now gotten another change in steel and aluminum tariffs. And more importantly, not only have those tariffs gone up again, but the way they are assessed and what they are assessed on has changed. So for example, you bring in distillation equipment from China, you're now facing a China tariff, a steel and aluminum tariff, a fentanyl tariff, and maybe one or two other tariffs. And if it's a steel and aluminum tariff, anything that has steel in it, so you bring in a copper still with a steel valve, chances are you may have a steel and aluminum tariff assessment against that because there's a steel component on that piece of equipment. And what's even more confusing is even the US Customs Service today doesn't have clarity on how to assess these tariffs. They're still trying to figure it out because things are changing so fast on the policy side. So again, what that means for us as business people, we got to come up with options. We got to stay on top of this, and we need to try and figure out how to navigate the storm. And when I say options, it's more than one option. Because as these tariff changes, you may want to change your business decisions to react to them, if at all possible. Any questions on that? All right. Anti-dumping or countervailing duties and tariffs. I wanted to talk about these specifically because they directly affect the alcohol beverage ecosystem. Most notably, over the last several years, there's been an ongoing anti-dumping investigation against China, India, and Mexico for alcohol beverage glass. As I said before, many of us source glass offshore, and the prices are usually very low. Now, late in the Biden administration, the initial findings indicated that there was no hard evidence of true dumping. I'm not sure I agree with that, but more importantly, I'm not sure the current administration agrees with that. And what an anti-dumping or countervailing duty and tariff is a punitive tariff specifically designed to counteract a dumping activity. So a dumping activity is a term used to describe when one country is exporting goods at below fair market value to another country. So I would be shocked if at some point we didn't see a anti-dumping or countervailing duty on alcohol glass suddenly appear in our ecosystem. The other thing we've talked about steel and we've talked about the shipment of distillation equipment from various countries, most notably China. Right now, even with the ramped up tariffs against Chinese goods, it's still often cheaper to buy tanks and stills and other related equipment from China than it is to buy it in North America, especially in the US. My gut feel is we're probably going to see some sort of anti-dumping or countervailing duty or tariff hit our industry at some point in the next 12 to 36 months. So that's something just to keep an eye on because there's such a disparity in the cost of distillation equipment coming out of especially China and tanks and et cetera, as there is to coming out of from other parts of the world. Last but not least, punitive retaliatory duties and tariffs. Now, these are hugely important for our industry, and many of us have felt the pain of these. So if you go back to 2018, when during the first Trump administration, they enacted steel and aluminum tariffs and then the Boeing Airbus dispute with the EU. The EU assessed punitive or retaliatory tariffs very quickly, and the very first commodity they hit with one of these tariffs was American whiskey. As a result, between 2018 and 2022, and Chris, correct me if my numbers are wrong, the US lost in the UK 53% market share and in the EU 49% market share.
It's a little high, but we lost market share. But since the tariffs have been suspended, that market share has rebounded twofold. Yeah.
Well, but I'll add one more thing on that. Prior to that dispute, there were a number of small and medium-sized producers in the US that had significant UK and EU market penetration. Post the removal of those retaliatory tariffs, largely due to Discus's efforts, we have regained market share, but the businesses that were able to regain that share were predominantly the larger producers, because the smaller producers didn't have the ability to weather the storm. And unfortunately, my company felt the pain of that, as did many of the other small and medium-sized producers I work with. The point being is that once we get into a tariff war, regardless of the underpinnings, it will change the market landscape no matter what you do. All right, harmonized tariff. Well, before that, any other questions on tariffs? All right, so the harmonized tariff code system is the numerical system that is actually used to assess tariffs throughout the bulk of the world. And when I say harmonized, it's only loosely harmonized. I mean, the chapters in 170 countries are roughly the same, but once you get down into the individual product codes, they can vary wildly. They are typically hierarchical, and what that means is the lower the number, the less work's been done. So your raw materials, at a fundamental standpoint, will be single or double digits, 0, 1, to et cetera. Most of your alcohol beverages is in Chapter 22, because while it's manufactured, it doesn't have a whole lot of high-level manufacturing, and I know we as distillers might argue that. But as you go higher in the tariff code, for example, a car is Chapter 87. An aircraft or aircraft components are Chapter 88. And those have a lot more manufacturing complexity than, say, an alcohol beverage, which is down in Chapter 22. So the HTS system is loosely controlled around the world by a series of different treaties. The most common one is the um, World Trade Organization, the WTO. And the WTO is the result of years of negotiations between the major economies of the world on ways to effectively deal with each other. Now, the important thing to understand about tariffs is this provides a common lexicon, if you will, or somewhat common, where you can bring something under a certain numerical classification from one number, from one country to another number. And that customs officer who doesn't know what we do for a living, who doesn't understand our business, doesn't understand alcohol beverage, doesn't understand what a still is, can look at that number, and if it is classified appropriately, knows what he's looking at or she's looking at, and knows how to effectively assess duties, taxes, and other regulatory issues to that commodity or that product. And so the process of assigning that number is called tariff classification. And tariff classification, there are people that are professionals in this. There are lawyers that do this. And then the most common profession is that in the United States of a licensed customs broker. And that is a certification similar to the CPA given by the US government, where the professional becomes a subject matter expert in CFR Title 19, that's Code of Federal Regulations, which is the US tariff code and trade related regulations. And then this is hugely important. Everybody that clears a good at one way, shape, or form at least has a customs broker that will touch it. But the reality is a customs broker knows Title 19 and classifications. They don't know whiskey, they don't know distillation equipment, they don't know closures, they don't know bottles, they know numbers. So we as people in the alcohol beverage ecosystem need to proactively work with our professional advisors, whether they be lawyers or customs brokers or et cetera, to do the tariff classification to make sure the tariff classification is accurate. Now, as an example, one of the things that I see all too often in the alcohol beverage world with exporters is everybody in the US whiskey world assumes that the tariff classification for all American whiskey is the tariff classification for bourbon. It's not. Bourbon is a unique classification, separate from single malt, separate from rye, separate from blended whiskey. They're similar, they're only a couple numbers off, but especially in the environment where we're at today, where say Canada, for example, has very specifically called out bourbon in this trade dispute. If you send your rye whiskey or your single malt or your blended whiskey across the border and it's classified as a bourbon, you might face additional scrutiny and you might face additional tariff costs solely by getting the number wrong on your invoice. So it's really important that people drill down and look at what these tariff rates are and assign the numbers appropriately. Because again, that customs officer that's assessing the cost at the receiving port, all he knows is it's a brown liquid that gets you drunk. You know, he doesn't know how it's made. He doesn't know what the mash bill is. He doesn't know what the law states as far as classification. All he knows is you put a number that says it's blah, blah, blah whiskey. And whether that number's right or wrong, he doesn't care at the time. All he cares about is, okay, you said it's bourbon, I'm assessing a bourbon tariff. So if they do decide to do a detailed inspection and find out what you've shipped is not correct based on your number, which they could, now you have another problem. And that is they're going to stop your shipment. They're going to park it in customs hold. They're going to wait for someone to do a detail. They're going to call in the experts. They might even do lab tests. And now they're mucking with your shipment. You might lose goods. You might have goods seized. You might get stuck with a freight bill or a storage bill or an inspection bill or a lab bill or all of the above that you didn't plan on. So again, it's incredibly important that you be proactive in assigning these numbers. The other thing that's important that you do is on your commercial invoices that you're submitting to customs, is you actually list the tariff code on that invoice per line item to make it easy for that customs official to know what he's looking at. And further, because not all the harmonized tariff code is not truly harmonized, when you list that tariff code, you want to list, I'm using the US harmonized tariff code, I'm using the UK harmonized tariff code, I'm using the Canadian harmonized tariff code, so that that customs official knows where you're getting that number, because that end number may not directly line up to the tariff he's got in his hand, to the book he's got in his hand. So are there any questions on tariff classification? So the last thing on classification I want to talk about is what's called tariff engineering. I kind of hate that term, and customs officials don't like that term, but it's really common here in the international trade world today. And what that means is you're working with someone that's an expert in classification to assign a tariff code that optimizes what's going on and minimizes your duty and tariff exposure. You need to understand it, but you also need to be very careful in how you refer to it, because it also has a negative connotation on the part of regulatory officials as to what you're really doing. So you need to take a look at your classification. You need to make sure that your classifications are accurate. And when I say accurate, it's the most correct tariff code with the lowest tariff rate. And I'll give you another example outside the alcohol beverage world that I dealt with a few years ago. So the company was an air conditioning company, and they were bringing in both window air conditioning units and dehumidifiers. They were the largest window unit and dehumidifier manufacturer in the world. I took a look at what they were doing. And truth in advertising, I was their vice president of global supply chain, and all trade advisory fell under my organization. So I was not a consultant. They were clearing their dehumidifiers as air conditioners with at the time a 3.7% duty, which was millions of dollars due to the volumes they were doing. I went into the tariff code, and under the general rules of interpretation and in the individual classifications, was able to justify to U.S. Customs that there was a general tariff for dehumidifiers with a 0% duty rate, and that the product was by definition a dehumidifier and therefore qualified for the lower tariff. We were able to then recover almost $4 million in duty paid over the previous year. And that company continued, after I left, importing those goods duty free because the tariff rate was 0. Now, obviously, that world has changed, but that is proper tariff engineering, where someone's actually doing a deep dive and making sure the right numbers line up. Any questions on that? All right. So next I want to talk about Incoterms. Now, Incoterms are a series of legal terms established by the International Chamber of Commerce that bear the force of contractual terms. Now, what that means is that they set the border or the line in the sand where the responsibility for cost and liability transfers from seller to buyer in an international transaction. And all too often in any size company, these terms are neglected and thought of as afterthoughts, and companies end up paying for things they don't expect to pay for, or not pay for things they should pay for, or end up with liabilities they didn't realize they had, or end up paying for liabilities such as damage and loss that they shouldn't be paying for. So as you can see on the slide, transfer of ownership and transfer of liability. The three most common terms internationally are ex-works or EXW, but there are 20, I think it's 24 under the current Incoterms. And ex-works stands for the goods, all ownership, all liability for costs, etc., transfers when the shipment crosses the dock at the shipper. So if you're in a distillery, this is when that pallet load goes into the sea container that's on the back of the truck. Crosses your dock, it's in the sea container. You no longer own it and you no longer have liability for it. So if that truck pulls out of your dock and that pallet falls off the back of that truck into your parking lot and those bottles are destroyed, legally it's not your issue. Legally, the buyer has to fight with the trucking company for the damage because it's not your issue. The freight for that trucking company is not your issue. And here's where a lot of people make the mistake. They'll do Ex Works and then they'll pay the trucking company to haul the goods away. If you're quoting Ex Works, your buyer should be paying that trucking company. What that also means is an international shipment, all costs, including duties, tariffs, etc., from the point it leaves that dock is borne by the buyer. Next is FOB. Now, FOB is probably the most misused and misunderstood term in logistics today. For an international shipment, this means where the goods cross the threshold or rail of the international conveyance at the named port. Okay? So a lot of times you'll see an FOB and it's at the factory. That's really Ex Works. And that causes some legal ambiguity on who owes what where. So free on board for an ocean shipment is when those goods cross the actual rail of the ship. And that is all cost, all liability. So that means the seller will pay for the loading onto the ship, but once that container or that box or whatever crosses the rail of that ship, all further on costs down the road are borne by the buyer. What it also means is if that, say you've got a container load of bottles and the crane drops it, it hits the deck of the ship, bounces back on the dock, and the cargo is destroyed. If it's crossed that rail, the buyer has to go and bear those costs and fight with insurance. If the crane drops it before it crosses that rail, the seller has to fight that fight with insurance and bear those costs. Next, delivered duty paid. Now this is important, and there's a twin to this called delivered duty unpaid. Now, as I mentioned before, duty and tariff for this discussion are synonymous. So if you buy a piece of equipment from, and I'm going to say China again because I've got clients right now that I'm advising on this. You buy distillation equipment in China. Your term is delivered duty paid. All the changes in all the duties and tariffs that we're facing right now are borne by the seller. If you're the buyer and your contract or your PO says DDP or delivered duty paid on it, those aren't your problem. The seller pays freight, duty, taxes, and holds liability until it's unloaded at your facility. Now, having said that, what we're seeing in the marketplace is that your exporters are now demanding more money before they'll ship, even though they've agreed contractually to a DDP term. So I have one client right now that has 3 stills sitting in China. She's trying to get them out. She said, well, should I ship? I'm worried about paying all these extra duties and tariffs. I said, no, because you paid for this stuff 8 months ago and you've got a contract. And then I said to her, I'd be shocked if your seller will ship to you. And that's exactly what happened. The seller said, you need to write us an extra check for all the additional duties and tariffs. Well, legally she doesn't, but it doesn't mean the supplier is going to ship, right? In converse, there's the twin to this is DDU, delivered duty unpaid. That means that the seller is still going to pay all the costs all the way from point of origin until it's unloaded at your facility, except for duties. which means that the duty liabilities and the uncertainty are borne by the buyer. So it's incredibly important that you as a business person understand what these terms are. And there's one more wrinkle, and that is, or two more wrinkles. One, if you're importing alcohol, technically, legally, you could argue that excise tax falls under these terms, but it doesn't mean that the people you're doing business with are going to agree to that, and then you have a legal battle. So as you use these terms and these terms show up on your shipping documents, and these are on your purchase orders, on your contracts, you need to make sure that you remove any ambiguity before you send any money or ship any goods. Because you may be dead right and it's black letter law, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to have a legal fight over it. So the more ambiguity you can remove in the transaction, the better. And this is typically more attention than most people in the business world ever pay these documents. And last but not least, I'm going to say it again. When you have your commercial invoices, break out your freight and other costs from your goods, or you're going to pay duty and taxes on them. And who pays those will tie to these Incoterms. But if you don't break them out on the invoice, someone's going to assess a duty, a tax, a fee on the full value, including freight and logistics costs. And you don't want that because that's money you're giving one or more governments for free that you don't need to spend. Now, having said that, there are countries that will come back and say, okay, your good's $100, but it costs you $40 to ship it. We're assessing your import duties, et cetera, on that $140. There's not much you can do about that, but if you can avoid that by just clarifying it on your invoice, you're better off as a business person because it's money you don't have to spend. And any duty, tariff, or tax payment that you can reduce or avoid goes straight to your bottom line. Always keep that in mind. Spending money to get help in optimizing what duties and taxes you're not paying goes straight to the bottom line. Spending money on marketing, sales, PR does not. So you make your own business decisions, but if you can optimize what you're doing as you're moving your materials across borders, it's going to directly affect your bottom line one way or the other. All right. Any questions?
Steve, if you'd like, I can give everybody an update
Please.
on kind of where we are in the multi-front challenge related to the current environment, if that's okay.
Mhm.
So everybody may be aware, if you've been following this in the news, the Trump administration is actively negotiating with, Trump even said it, I think last night or this morning, 15 to 17 countries. And we know Japan, South Korea, India, certainly the EU. The major battlefronts that we're concerned with is certainly tariffs between the US and the EU, tariffs between the US and the UK, and then the ongoing challenges, particularly in Canada for the moment. So we do know that, at least knock on wood, that negotiations are underway steadfast between the US and the EU. The Trump administration was not pleased with the EU's dialogue for about 10 ongoing meetings. And we do know the US and EU are negotiating hard. It may go past the July 9th deadline where the Trump administration has basically said these deals need to be done or we're going to impose massive tariffs on your particular markets. So we're hoping, and next week at our Discus board meeting, we have the EU ambassador visiting with us. I think we're in pretty good shape with the US and the UK, knock on wood. The UK was the first country that came to an agreement with the Trump administration when he kind of set the July 9th deadline. We've got some positive news coming out of Canada, where two of the provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta are putting American products back on their state store shelves. Ontario's the big one, obviously, but we're hoping that there's some positive momentum. Canada is still applying a 25% tariff on American whiskey going into Canada, and that's
Hey,
problematic.
can I make one comment on that?
Yeah,
I don't think most people realize this unless you've actually been in the Canadian market, but the several of Canada's provinces are similar to our control states in the US, and the government of Ontario is the single largest spirits buyer on the planet.
yeah.
For that matter, prior to this current trade dispute, 31% of US exports of whiskey went to Canada, and that equates to roughly 6% of our total national production of whiskey. So Canada is hugely important.
So to give you a sense, this is how we're working together. And one thing that I forgot to mention, Discus is working closely. There's no light between us and Spirits Canada. No light between Discus and the Tequila Chamber in Guadalajara, Spirits Europe in the EU, the Scotch Whisky Association. So all the collective industry and all of these big trading markets are working together to get us back to 0 for 0 tariffs. There is no jockeying, and that helps us. In Canada exports about 500 million in distilled spirits products to the US. That's because American consumers love Canadian whiskey, right? We only export $250 million worth of distilled spirits products, but it's a 30 million population market versus the US 300 million. Obviously, take those underage out of the equation. I think between Canada and Mexico, sometime over the next 2 to 3 months, the US, Canada, and Mexico will start renegotiating the USMCA, the big free trade agreement that was solidified and Trump won. So we need the cooperation of our trading partners. It's very, very good that the EU, at least at this point, has said that they're not going to impose a tariff on American whiskey. So we are pitching a deal, particularly with the US and the EU, what's called the US-EU hospitality deal, where it's a way to form a working group between the two governments that would hopefully inoculate distilled spirits being on the target list. And for the EU in particular, and that way the US and the EU could work on trade barriers around the world, like Vietnam, there's a 45% tariff. India, right now, there's a 100% tariff on American whiskey and 150% tariff on all other US spirits. So we do need the Trump administration certainly to have some success in their trade agreements. I am hopeful, a little optimistic. I'm a glass half full guy that if things go well with whatever the Trump administration's doing with the respective trade agreements, we do have an opportunity to untangle ourselves out of some of these. And from a longer term perspective, we can open up some new markets like Vietnam and like India and so forth.
Hey, Chris, can I make one comment about the USCMA?
Yep.
So the assumption has been on the part of many producers in Mexico, the US, and Canada that the USCMA basically negates a lot of these tariffs.
It does.
It does, but what we're seeing in practice at the border is a lot of the certification that these qualify under the treaty. Those certifications are being challenged by customs in all directions.
In all directions.
In all directions, not just on the US. So it's incredibly important that if you're getting that preferential duty treatment, that you go back, look at what those commodities are, and make sure your paperwork's in order and it's defendable when someone questions it, or you might get bit with a tariff you're not expecting.
Yeah, and that's the magic sauce, Steve, you can help with. A big part every year.
Or I can refer to people that can. Yeah, I mean, I do some of that,
Yeah.
but there are companies that specialize in that, and I can help people find those because that's really something a broker should be doing. That your broker that's doing your customs clearance,
Yeah.
I as a broker give trade advisory services.
Got
So
it.
I can go in and say, you need to look at this with the person that's clearing your goods or the company.
Yeah, a big priority for the Trump administration is not only making sure tariffs are equal or fair and reciprocal, but to also knock down trade barriers as well. In agriculture, the U.S. has significant trade barriers with the EU in agriculture for a whole host of reasons. So a big component of the Trump administration's strategy is to knock down trade barriers. So if someone's having specific trade barrier problems in a particular market, let us know because every year we submit a 30-page document that outlines all the market opportunities for U.S. distilled spirits. And we identify for the U.S. government all the trade barriers in specific markets as well. So, and I'm lucky, I've got a great international trade team that is in dialogue with U.S. embassies around the world, USTR, the Commerce Department to help do that. So knock on wood, I hope Discus is doing our job right. We're going to work really, really hard to untangle us from all of these tariffs. There's no certainty. It's a volatile marketplace. We have a president that approaches these issues in a very unorthodox way. There is no evidence at all that the president is bent against distilled spirits. He's just all about reducing the trade deficit. We're educating them on that for our industry and knocking down trade barriers to create more American jobs and thrive the U.S. economy. There's a lot of different opinions of how, what, style, and all of that type of stuff. But we're going to do our best and hopefully the industry comes out smelling like a rose despite the white knuckle turbulence we're all living through. And, you know, a little bit of a defense of the president, he did forecast that it's going to be bumpy until these things come together. What remains to be seen is these things haven't really come together yet, right? And that's the onus on the Trump administration to prove otherwise.
Well, gents, I want to say thank you to you guys being here, Chris and Stephen. Always a pleasure to see you all, and look forward to seeing you in person, if not before, in August. I appreciate this is you know, it's on everybody's mind. It's such and I know nobody's got a crystal ball, but it certainly is topical and relevant, and will continue to be so. And you know, maybe we'll do this again in a couple of months as things settle out and shake out, and there's new information to be shared.
Let me add one more thing. There's a white paper on my website. You can find me consultingalchemist.com, underwritten by both Distilled Spirits Council and ADI, that covers a lot of these same topics in a little more detail, that you can use as a resource. And if I can answer questions for people, as I've always said, advice is free. If it starts to look like a consulting project, we're going to have another discussion. But I don't mind people calling me and asking questions.
Great. Thanks for adding that in, Steve. And I want to also thank Eric for taking time out of his schedule to jump in here with us and talk about membership and the conference. And I just appreciate you all being here. I appreciate all the attendees. We have another one in 2 weeks about how to sort of navigate not the tariff waters, but just the sort of down or scary, in some senses, market, and how to manage that for your business, and how to buckle down a little bit without missing out on brand building opportunities. And that's in 2 weeks. So thanks to everybody. I appreciate it very much. Eric, do you have any closing remarks?
That's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And
Thank you, everybody.
Stephen, and thank you, Chris, for your time.
Yeah, we'll see you in
Great.
San Antonio.
Awesome.
Thanks so
Looking
much.
forward to it. Thanks,
Take
guys.
care.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.